In a lot of ways, Dark Souls 2 is kind of like the Ryan Lochte of the Souls series. If you don't know who that is, he's the second most highly decorated male swimmer of all time, right behind Michael Phelps. In fact, he spent a majority of his competing years just barely losing to Phelps, racking up silver medal after silver medal. It creates a kind of unfair and inaccurate picture of him. He was unbelievably talented, but outside of the world of swimming enthusiasts, most people only really know him as Shitty Phelps. And I know that this is a weird way to start a game review, but I worry about being unfair to Dark Souls 2 in a similar way. Because just like with Ryan Lochte, to a lot of people, Dark Souls 2 is basically Shitty Souls.
Dark Souls, I don't know what's more inconsistent. Hitboxes in this game or the level design. It's a race to the bottom.
For me personally, just about every feature of this game that stands out to me because I like the way that Dark Souls 1 did things better. This is the second video in what's going to be a series of Fromsoft reviews, and I'm not going to spend a bunch of time in all of these videos going over the basics of what makes a Souls game a Souls game. This means that this review is going to be fairly light on praise because for the most part, the things I like in Dark Souls 2 were also done well in the first game. The biggest area for discussion here is what the game changed, and for the most part, I'm not the biggest fan of the changes that were made. But I still very much enjoyed the game, and in fact, I'd go as far as to call it great. But the bulk of this review is going to be spent detailing problems that I had with the game rather than singing its praises. I'm saying this now to get ahead of the inevitable whiplash that's gonna come from the body of this review seeming kinda negative and the final score at the end actually being pretty damn good. And to mitigate that whiplash even further, I'm gonna structure this video as sort of a criticism Oreo, with compliments starting and ending the video. There's a lot of filling in this Oreo, and so I'm gonna do my best to make the cookie bits extra enticing. It's really hard to make sense out of Dark Souls 2 without having just a bit of context about how and when it was developed. It's the follow-up game to Dark Souls, which was the breakout hit for developer Fromsoft. And here's what's so remarkable about Fromsoft as a company. Right after this breakout hit, the main creative leads decided to move right along to a totally new IP with dramatically different core gameplay mechanics. They didn't want to devolve into franchise slop. They wanted to keep innovating, to keep refining, to keep creating new worlds and stories and sandboxes. Dark Souls came from a place of passion and creative freedom. If you were a game developer in the late 2000s, no amount of focus group testing would have told you that making a game like Dark Souls would lead you to all-time classic status. There's this really famous story of a Sony executive playing Demon's Souls ahead of its release and commenting, quote, "This is an unbelievably bad game." But this feedback doesn't seem to have fazed Fromsoft at all. They stayed committed to their vision because they knew that they were creating something special. Today, Fromsoft is one of the most beloved game developers of all time, in no small part because of this refusal to play it safe, this insistence on perpetual innovation. And it seems so obvious to us in hindsight that they took the right approach because we see what this approach led to, but as they were planning their next steps after the breakout success of Dark Souls, they didn't have the benefit of hindsight. They were taking a serious risk in starting from scratch with a new IP with nothing to reassure themselves with aside from the knowledge of just how damn good they were at what they do. And at the same time, the spreadsheet people did get to have their say. Alright, fine, go ahead and make your weird Lovecraftian plague world, but by fucking god, we're making a sequel to Dark Souls. We're not gonna let this brand momentum slip through our fingers or the investors will call for heads to roll. And full disclosure, I'm gonna start reading between the lines a bit with this take, but it seems to me that Fromsoft might have taken the following approach to Dark Souls 2's development. Alright, we're making this game out of a kind of obligation. We just need to release another game with Dark Souls in the title, and the team that's gonna make it will be a less seasoned, younger team. If we tell this team to follow a strict design playbook based around recreating the first game, then the best case scenario is that Dark Souls 2 is going to feel like a crappy knockoff of the first game. But if we tell this team to just swing for the fences and experiment, to just try out all the ideas that we tinkered with but cut from the original game just to see what works, then in the worst case scenario, we learn a lot of valuable lessons. If we tell them to just run wild, then when our teams rejoin in a couple of years, we'll have a whole bunch of data in the form of player feedback to build our next game with. And here's what leads me to this speculation. Dark Souls 2 is by no means a by-the-numbers sequel. It shares just enough of the original game's design DNA to be barely recognizable as a sequel to Dark Souls, but playing it feels almost nothing like playing the first game. The design of its world is nothing like the design of Lordran, either aesthetically or in terms of how you explore it. The encounter design is drastically different. Combat and movement feel less tight and anchored and more quick and frantic, and there are a ton of new systems in the game that, at least on paper, dramatically increase the potential for player expression. I respect the hell out of the fact that this less experienced team had the confidence to experiment with such a successful formula, and here's where I'm gonna add the record scratch sound effect. Lots and lots of these experiments really didn't work for me. I need to talk about the core of the problem that I had with the game before I get into the review proper, because the things that I didn't like about it cooperated with each other in a way that harmed just about every element of the experience. My review system follows a double jeopardy rule. A game can't be docked in two different review categories for the same problem. The hardest thing about reviewing this game in particular is that the problems that I had with it were so widespread and so baked into the experience that it's hard to really decide where to apply the criticism. In reviewing Dark Souls, it was really easy for me to just put everything I didn't like about the game into the seamlessness category because the game had me completely immersed, save for these instances where the immersion shattered, the seams of the experience, so to speak. And this is gonna sound really mean to say, but in Dark Souls 2 it gets really hard to point to seams because they're so omnipresent that they practically define the experience.
Okay, so what it did is it gave me a little pool of water that apparently cures poison, but the problem there is I'd have to poison myself for that to be useful. Why?
In Dark Souls 2, I felt mechanically nudged. That isn't a bad thing in and of itself. In fact, Sekiro is my favorite Fromsoft game, and that game's practically defined by the way that it nudges you towards being more assertive in fights. But in Dark Souls 2, I felt nudged towards a bean-countingly boring playstyle, and it wasn't one part of the game that did this. Virtually every aspect of its design cooperated to push me to this playstyle. This playstyle negatively affected almost every part of the experience. It limited the potency of the world's illusion, it limited my engagement with the world, and it inhibited my ability to be immersed in the experience. And every time that I tried to fight the instinct to just treat the experience as a video game, to try to see the credits roll as fast as possible, every time I tried to buy its fictional premise and to explore some mystery or seek some reward, I just felt like the game reminded me that I was making a bad choice.
Please stop doing that. Please stop creating puddles. God, how did I not see that coming?
Let me briefly just describe the 4 main issues that I had with the game. Fresh out of playing the first Dark Souls, I was extremely excited to get to Dark Souls 2 because I hadn't played it at all since it first released, and I was shocked at how little I remembered about the game. I figured that of all of the games that I was going to review for this series, this was the one that gave me the best shot at something like a blind playthrough.
Man, I don't remember any of this. Replaying Dark Souls was like this constant flush of nostalgia, but I don't remember anything from this game. It's like I'm playing it for the first time.
Going into it though, part of me knew what the main culprit here was. My memory of this game is so crappy because it's borderline impossible to develop a mental map of the game world. A while back, I ran into this piece of wall art for Dark Souls 1, and if you've played the game, I bet you can physically feel this piece. Oh, fuck yeah, that does connect. Oh, look, it's got the little well that goes down. Oh, fuck, I want it. Demon's Souls was a series of isolated worlds that were connected by a central hub, and Dark Souls 2 seems to basically split the difference between this approach and the seamless exploration of Dark Souls 1. The parts of the world feel like completely isolated and separate zones, but there's no loading screen separating them. You traverse the world on foot seamlessly. Your hub world is Majula, which is this hauntingly beautiful cliffside village where you level up and meet with various NPCs over the course of the game. Go through a hole in the wall and you're at this stunning castle. Hop on a descending elevator from that castle and you end up in Pirate World. Jump on a boat from Pirate World and you end up at this spooky asylum. Which, I mean, hold on, wait, I've been here. I'm sure I've been. A bird picked me up from some ramparts and took me here. So was that just an alternative way of getting to the same place? And if it was, like, why did I spend a bunch of time exploring here? I mean, I used a consumable resource and it didn't really do anything, and now I feel kind of dumb for wasting it. Like, what is this? The reason I used a fragrant branch to unlock a mage I found a while back was that I thought that this was the next way I was supposed to go, and if I had known this was just a meaningless detour, I would have saved it to unlock another path. So now I just kind of need to look up where to go next, which is not that fun. Okay, the internet says that if I go back to an area I've already cleared, there's an NPC there now who will open a different path. I just had to look up where to go because my mental map of this world is a complete soup. The Poison Windmill has an elevator that takes you to Mordor, the Haunted Mansion has an elevator leading to Dragonland, and the Spider Pit has a hallway that connects to an immaculately maintained library. And within all of those areas, branching just leads to more branching, which leads to more twisty-turny hallways that all look the same that I somehow need to remember to come back to once I found some key. In Souls games, I typically feel this really strong wanderlust. When I have a hunch that a secret is nearby, I'm just drawn to exploration like a moth to flame. But this feeling didn't last particularly long in my playthrough of Dark Souls 2. This is partially the result of the labyrinthine nature of the world that I was just describing, and the fact that navigating the world just kinda gave me a headache. But it also has a lot to do with just how much stuff was added to the sandbox of this game. It's actually really cool that they put a lot of focus into making sure that as many different playstyles as possible were viable. In Dark Souls 2, a number of brand new weapon types have been added, as well as unique movesets for dual wielding. Item stat scaling was also tinkered with a bit to make dual classing more viable, and there are more factions to explore with more unique benefits. There's also a totally new class of spells in the game, and look, that's all cool. It's really, really cool. It also means, though, that as I'm out navigating the world and trying to make sense of its twisty-turny nature, that I'm not particularly likely to find an item that will benefit my player because there's just so much stuff in this game. In this branchy, twisty, unintuitive type of world design, it's more time-consuming to go looking for secrets, and at the same time, it's less likely that the items that I find will benefit me because there's so many items in this game. And the other thing that I'm starting to learn is the playstyle that I'm gravitating towards doesn't seem to be particularly gear-dependent. I decided to start out by following the formula that I was just using in my Dark Souls playthrough, two-handing a weapon without a shield. But I was very much committed to tinkering and experimenting. After all, I remembered that you can respec your character in this game, so I figured that I would try things out and A/B test my way over time to a unique playstyle. Well, one difference between this game and Dark Souls 1 is that you don't find a whole lot of heavy weapons right at the start, so I defaulted to two-handing just the basic normal weapons that I had picked up along my way. I figured that this was going to be my playstyle, and I wanted to keep myself practiced at that fight style so that when I found a greatsword or a Zweihander, the transition would be clean. And I tinkered around with these weapons and experimented for a bit, but that was really cut short when I realized that the mace did better against virtually every type of enemy that I encountered. Blunt weapons do more damage to armored opponents in this game, and you fight tons and tons of these enemies, frequently in groups. It did way more damage than the sword that I had been using, and it also seemed to be just about as effective when I used it one-handed, which made it virtually free to use a shield. But then I found a greatsword, and I found that I didn't like it even compared to one-handing the mace. It has this extremely frustrating built-in potential to miss if you're putting in any thumbstick input while you attack, which just represents an opportunity to miss that you straight up don't have with other weapons. And while it did stagger enemies into chain attack windows, so did my mace, even when I used it one-handed. Which meant that if I wanted to switch to the greatsword, I was adding the potential to miss, sacrificing a fast attack opportunity, and dropping a shield for basically no perceivable benefit. And so, kinda disappointed, I went back to the mace, and I kept upgrading the mace, and then I upgraded the shield that I was using with the mace, to the point that this setup was so much more powerful than anything I stood a chance of finding before I upgraded it that I didn't have a lot of reason to keep tinkering. This weapon that I had found in the first hour of the game was just deleting everything, and it let me have a shield for free. And here's the thing, I usually prefer ditching a shield in this type of game, but that was not the case in Dark Souls 2 at all, and I'm gonna tell you a bit about why. Aside from its twisty, turny, sorta unintuitive overworld design, the most infamous quality of Dark Souls 2 by far is the way that you just constantly feel it sticking its tongue out at you. As a sequel to a game that was most popularly known for its difficulty, it seems that a very significant priority was preventing any part of the experience from feeling easy. Now, a sequel to Dark Souls legitimately did need to find some solution to one of its core design faults, and it's one that I mentioned in my review of the game. The fact that in singular combat, so many of its enemies are complete cakewalks if you just fish for backstabs. Dark Souls 2 seems to have been designed from the ground up around making it as hard as possible for you to do this, and its primary strategy for doing this seems to be a shift towards group-based encounters. It seems that the default state of combat is fighting groups, and this is true both during world exploration and in boss fights. In the original Dark Souls, if you ever ended up fighting a group of enemies while you were out exploring, it typically felt like you had just paid too little attention to how you navigated the world, and if boss fights included more than one enemy, there was usually a satisfying and intuitive aha moment where you could figure out, for instance, that one of the enemy's faster movement makes them easy to separate from the other enemy. But Dark Souls 2 seems like it was designed from the ground up so that group fights are just the norm. You'll fight 2 or 3 of the same enemy in a boss fight with nothing like an aha moment coming from the fight. It seems like the fight would have just been too easy if there was only one enemy. And during world exploration, it doesn't really feel like group combat is the result of bad decision making. Enemies are typically designed to aggro in packs, so group combat is the default state of things unless you take additional efforts to draw aggro one at a time, which just slows the game to a snail's pace. The world is also just absolutely full of every type of sucker punch trick that you can imagine. If you thought that Dark Souls 1 enjoyed punishing you for failing to pay close attention to its world, just know that this specific part of its design philosophy has been emphasized here to the point of near parody.
Oh, you troll game!
These 4 sources of pain cooperated in pushing me to a playstyle that I didn't particularly enjoy, one characterized by a desire to just see the credits roll as soon as possible. For instance, I would find myself looking over at an item in the distance that I'd clearly have to explore to obtain, and the Souls instinct would take over. I want to go try and find it. It's a collectible that I don't have, and I therefore need to have it. But then this counter voice would pop into my head that would say the following. Dude, just take a moment and reflect on how you got here. You had to get past a wall of fungal enemies that you physically couldn't maneuver past that chained together an attack that destroyed your equipped items and made you have to use repair powder or go back to town for repairs. Once you slogged through that, you got to an area where magic archers were standing in a perfect circle in which anytime you went for one of them, the others could hit you, and you were in water that slowed your movement, and there were little enemies under that water that you couldn't see, and you got invaded when you went too far into the area. And after somehow finding the will to go through all of that for a half hour to get to those items, they were items that you were never going to end up using. And at the end of the day, what do you really need new items for anyways? This shield and mace combo renders virtually everything in the game easy, except for the unintuitive curveballs. Well, regardless of what that item is, the curveballs are always going to cause problems. You're gonna die on the giant boss fight a couple times until you realize that standing in a certain position in front of him queues up a one-hit kill attack that you don't see winding up. Once you know that about him though, it's a total cakewalk of a fight, and it doesn't make that big of a difference if you can kill him in 11 hits instead of 14. Also, a shield just totally negates so many of the tricks that the game uses to try to trip you up, so does it really matter what that item is? Why would you subject yourself to almost certain trolling and frustration for an item that you're either never going to use or that even if you will, won't really do much for the true difficulty of the game? What if you just keep rolling with this shield and mace combo, keep your encumbrance below about 50%, and then just go through the rest of the game whacking every enemy that you meet in the butt until they disappear?
You know what? Whatever that thing is probably sucks. But I'm not gonna deal with the game being all shitty to get a fucking spear that I'm never gonna use.
Lots of the joy of these games is supposed to come from building your character to optimize it for some specific strategy, but I ended up optimizing my character build to minimize the amount of time that I spent playing Dark Souls 2. I mean, you do it however you want to do it. I feel like I made the right choice. The presentation of Dark Souls 2's world shares a lot of the same strengths as that of the original. You're dropped into a bizarre and deadly world that's slowly withering and dying, and just about every element of this world feels like it's concealing its true purpose. It successfully maintains the core Fromsoft experience of piecing together the lore through NPC dialogue, reading item descriptions, and reading between the lines a bit. There is one element of its presentation in which it inarguably surpasses the first game. It's full of these distinct and stunning set pieces, and some of these have such an overpowering grandeur to them that it creates a real wow moment. Just like its predecessor, Dark Souls 2 is full of moments that force you to just pause and take it all in. But unlike its predecessor, it failed to keep me in this state of awe. These moments felt like these isolated one-off events rather than parts of a cohesive experience because of the bizarre and unintuitive layout of the world. The transition between locations is so jarring and out of nowhere that they prevent you from ever really being under the illusion of a seamless, interconnected world. This volcanic palace, for instance, is difficult to believe in even when you consider it in isolation from the rest of the game. It's full of video gamey contrivances designed to troll you. Your baseline ability to believe in this world is hampered by the fact that you can feel the game doing this to you at basically all times. But the real death blow to the believability of this location comes from the fact that you arrive here after hopping on an elevator inside of a dilapidated, poison-filled windmill.
Is there some like lore explanation for that? Like was that like a illusory windmill or something? Is this like platform 9 3/4 or something?
Dark Souls 2's Drang-like feels like a random labyrinthine hodgepodge of distinct and separated zones, closer to the isolated worlds of Mario 64 than parts of a decaying kingdom. Part of what was so compelling about the world of Dark Souls was how the different parts of it were spatially related to one another. The fact, for instance, that the further down you travel, a story starts to emerge in your mind about the fact that the rulers of Lordran are contending with forces that are a lot older and more powerful than them. I'm not going to claim that I understand the world and backstory of Dark Souls, but the initial cutscene sets you up with a decent sense of who the relevant figures in the world are, and the spatial layout of the world basically tells a story. In Dark Souls 2, I wasn't able to get a whole lot out of the initial cutscene, aside from that I'd been drawn to some far-off mysterious land because of something having to do with a curse, and I wasn't able to piece anything meaningful together about the story by world exploration because the whole world felt so randomly cobbled together. My immersion in the world was further undercut by a well-discussed technical issue, the fact that the lighting in the game just feels fundamentally off. If you watch gameplay reveal trailers from 2013, you can see that Fromsoft had planned to build this game from the ground up around a new dynamic lighting system. And knowing this, it suddenly makes sense why this new torch system is so frequently emphasized by the game. In the original vision of the game, it makes a lot of sense, but in the game that we got, it seems kinda out of place and unnecessary, save for 1 or 2 locations. It seems that this dynamic lighting system was scrapped late in development due to performance issues on older consoles, and the result is this soft, unnaturally uniform lighting that robs the world of texture and richness. This is particularly problematic in indoor environments. It contributes to a feeling that you're in this dull, monotone gray maze. While the game did stun me with its visually unique and distinct set pieces, they remain isolated instances in my mind that failed to build something cohesive. Overall, I would say that Dark Souls 2 was above average in this category. At the end of the day, a lot of its set pieces did make me take a moment to just soak it all in. It's just unfortunate that these genuine moments of awe felt kinda isolated and random. This category is going to be a really difficult one for me to assign a score in because I'm torn between the game that Dark Souls 2 can be on paper and the game that I experienced. On paper, the game had a lot of really good ideas to encourage player experimentation. For instance, you now have 4 ring slots instead of 2, and the encumbrance system has been reworked to produce more of a continuous relationship between your gear weight and your movement speed, which should encourage you to tinker. A number of new weapon types were added to the game, and when you combine this increased weapon variety with new systems like power stancing, hexes, and the ability to respec your character, you're incentivized to create your own unique playstyle. I wanted to play through this game just like I had played through the original Dark Souls, forgoing a shield altogether and relying on a two-handed heavy weapon. But the addition of the adaptability stat effectively holds reliable dodging hostage unless you level that stat up, which forces you to forego other stat upgrading for the essential iframes. And even if you do make this trade-off, you're still pretty likely to find dodge-based damage avoidance to be kind of frustrating due to the unfortunate way that 2 of Dark Souls 2's design features kind of negatively interact. Because of the game's crowd-based combat encounters, dodging to avoid damage is going to demand a large number of inputs from the player, and this forms a toxic cocktail with the game's animation prioritization system. People with better knowledge of game design can probably explain this a lot better than me in the comments, but I'll put it this way: when you're making a lot of inputs, this game feels bizarrely unresponsive. The simplest solution to this problem for me was to switch to a shield-based playstyle that just minimized inputs altogether. This not only made the game perfectly responsive, it gave me a far superior method for damage mitigation in the numerous instances where the game restricts your mobility. This approach enabled me to spend all of my attention in fights navigating to be in position for a backstab, which as a side benefit grants you invincibility frames. And that's kind of a big deal in a game that constantly makes you fight 4 enemies at once. The majority of the game's challenge, which often revolved around cheap tricks and mobility limitation, was just largely negated when I switched to using a shield. And like I said before, I barely noticed a trade-off in weapon effectiveness when I used my mace one-handed. My mace still seemed to stun nearly every enemy, it just did a little bit less damage than when I two-handed it. Every time that I tried to deviate from this playstyle, it just increased the frustration of the experience for no perceivable benefit, so I ended up married to this shield and mace approach. The only real decision-making that was left for me was deciding what armor to wear, but I really early on just settled on using the strongest armor that I could wear without crossing the 50% encumbrance threshold. So while my equipped kit kept changing over the course of the game, the decision-making process stayed the same. I was following the same rigid formula at the end of the game that I had discovered around the 4-hour mark. The failure of the game to encourage experimentation unfortunately extended to the boss fights as well. A lot of them are visually and thematically interesting, but virtually all of them lack the satisfying aha moment of Dark Souls 1's combat puzzles. Instead, it felt like most of them were designed with the same guiding principle of the overworld combat: more enemies is harder and harder is better. Even the boss fights that didn't use this trick were a bit underwhelming. Defeating them typically revolved around figuring out what the trick was. In the Old Iron King fight, for instance, the trick is that little lava pit right there. Once you know that you don't want to stand near that lava pit, the boss basically just kills itself for you. The playthrough of Dark Souls 2 that I did for this review was the easiest Fromsoft experience I've ever had by far. I killed probably 2/3 of the bosses in the game on my first attempt. It's just kind of weird that it simultaneously managed to be the most consistently frustrating Fromsoft playthrough I've ever done. In assigning a score for this category, I'm in a tough spot. The experience that I had was merely above average. The only positive that I can say compared to Dark Souls 1 was that the frustration of some of the tedious boss runs did motivate me to try to experiment with consumables a bit more than I did in the first game. But I didn't tinker with many of the game's new systems unless the game basically forced me to. I just really couldn't find a reason to. There's far more exploration to do and vastly more secrets in the world to uncover if you're inclined to do so, but I was not inclined to. And so the fairest that I think I can be here is to give this game one more point than I think was representative of my experience to account for all of the possibilities that exist on paper. In my review of the original Dark Souls, I gushed over the sequences where I was just glued to the screen because I sensed such a clean relationship between my attention and my success in the game. Navigating Darkroot Forest, for instance, is unbelievably tense and gripping because the obstacle that you're dealing with seems natural. You're in this big open area where it's really easy to lose your sense of orientation, and the enemies that you're fighting naturally camouflage into the dimly lit, foggy scenery, so the consequence of charging ahead to obtain some reward is a natural one. You'll end up surrounded and overwhelmed, and in the chaos, you'll lose your sense of orientation and back yourself into a corner. The magic of the original game to me was in moments like this. You see some reward in the distance that you want, and you really sense that it could bring you serious benefits if you obtain it, but at the same time you know that you need to be careful as you move forward. You know that you stand an excellent chance of getting there and surviving to tell the tale if you take the encounter seriously. In Dark Souls 2, for the most part, neither of these two things are true. I neither want that item, nor do I sense a clean relationship between my attention and my success. Let me compare two gameplay sequences from Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. In the first, you're approaching a bridge that's guarded by a drake, and in the second, you're entering a foggy forest. Both of these encounters signal to you that danger's ahead of you. But in the first game, I had a couple of carrots dangling in front of me that I just don't have in the second game. For one, my mental map of the world is telling me that I'm very likely to unlock a shortcut by moving forward. I also see the source of the danger, and I feel that if I'm smart about how I go forward and I stay tuned in, I can avoid that danger. This tempts me into taking a calculated risk. Even though I have a lot of souls and no flasks, I'm really tempted to push forward. This was never the case for me in Dark Souls 2. For one, I have no mental map of this world whatsoever. For all I know, I could turn the next corner and see fucking sand dunes. The game also trolls you so hard and so constantly that whenever I have enough souls to level up, I want to use them then and there. And so I would just never push forward into a foggy forest like this if I had enough souls on me that I didn't want to lose.
Dark Souls 1, a situation like this, I would try to go forward. Because I'd have this sense in that game that if I just pay attention and really focus, I might hit the next bonfire. This is such a troll game, I don't want to lose enough souls to level up, so I'm going to go all the way back to the left.
And so how do you approach a sequence of gameplay like this one in Dark Souls 2? Well, again, this just seems to be a case where the game wants you to approach it one way, and that this just isn't the right way to do it. This area is full of invisible enemies that run away from you while they shoot at you, or that run in and backstab you while you interact with an item, and the game wants you to go very slowly and deal with these enemies one by one. But why would I do that though? Why would I spend 15 minutes fighting these things just to realize that I missed one that came up behind me to backstab me when I went to open a chest? As carefully as I might tippy-toe forward, I'm still likely to end up trolled by something that I didn't see coming, which means that before the next boss fight, I'm gonna end up using a human effigy no matter what. And it seems to me, therefore, that the way you want to handle situations like this is to just map the area out as quickly as you can. You should just die as many times as you need to figure out where all the hidden enemies are and where all the good loot is, and just not care at all if you die. Every time that you're killed, you know, okay, so there's one of those little enemies hiding in that corner, got it. As I kept playing this game, the stretches of gameplay between boss fights boiled down to me to just figuring out where all of the annoying little shit gimmicks were and learning how to sidestep them. Where are all the little curse pot things, or what path can I just take to get around them? How do I circumvent these little poison dart statues, because God fucking help me, I am not going to spend 10 minutes eliminating them one by one just to get killed by a little thing that pops out of a pool. I'd much rather just charge through, figure out where all the enemies are, and grab the easily grabbable items, then pop a human effigy before the boss and press on. Every time that I decided to play the game on its own terms, to slow down and smell the roses, I just felt that the game had wasted my time. But that's not really accurate to say. It was my fault in every case. After all, a man who embarks on a course of action in which trolling is guaranteed has trolled himself. I think Confucius said that, or I don't know, maybe it was Churchill. But that's not to say that the intoxicating, consuming Dark Souls experience is totally absent from this game, and in a small number of ways, I actually like the changes that were made. I like that many of the mysteries of the world were more intuitive. The solutions resulted from just sort of paying attention to the environment. For instance, you can very clearly see that a bonfire resides behind this big wall with a crack in it, which draws you to trying to find ways to manipulate the environment to produce an explosion. I like mysteries of this type that reward you for thinking about the environment as though you were there. Another thing that I enjoyed in this game in comparison to the original is the way that it handles choice and consequence with its NPC interactions. In Dark Souls, character quests often felt like they followed a straight line of progression. If you go collect enough magic doodads, for instance, then Solaire won't get uber syphilis and try to kill you. But the NPC interactions that you have in Dark Souls 2 frequently push you to make resource-driven choices that have permanent effects on the game world. I also really like these encounters in the game where I encountered some brooding evil weirdo and had to make a choice on the spot, like whether I wanted to free this dark wizard dude despite the fact that every clue in the environment was telling me to slow the fuck down and think about what I was about to do. And I like this sequence where a guy basically told me that he'd get super pissed if I lit a torch.
Fuck the police.
These decisions were neat. They had a consequence outside of the location in which they occurred, and I appreciated that they didn't result from a simple yes or no dialogue prompt. And yet, despite the fact that I can point to things that I liked more in Dark Souls 2, the game was overall way less capable of maintaining the illusion of its world. While Dark Souls 1 convinced me that I would do better if I slowed down, Dark Souls 2 convinced me that the time-saving move was to just iterate quickly. As spectacular as some of the set pieces of the world seemed, and as interesting as I found some of the game's ideas, exploring the world of Drangleic ultimately felt like mapping out a twisty-turny series of gotcha moments. I'm gonna be pretty brief in this review category because, like I said at the outset, I don't dock a game points for one problem in two different categories. Just as an example, the input queuing problem that I described before, where the game seems to delay your inputs because it's doing all this math to determine which of your recent button presses gets to the top of the animation priority queue, well, it's something that pushed me towards a boring playstyle that minimized inputs, and so I'm not going to dock the game again for something that I've already docked it points for. And that doesn't really leave us with a whole lot to talk about in this category. Just about all the things I didn't like about the game have already been accounted for in earlier categories. One thing that I have to mention here is a problem that also came up in my Dark Souls review. Most enemies in Dark Souls 2 suffer from an exaggerated form of the core problem with the first game's enemies, what I referred to in that review as pirate mode, where you prioritize the booty. When you fight most of the game's enemies in singular combat, it suddenly makes perfect sense why most combat encounters were designed as group fights. Most of the enemies in the game do virtually nothing to stop you from just fishing for backstabs. And I've already docked the game points for the fact that this pushed me towards a boring playstyle, but what I'm criticizing here is just how noticeable and immersion-breaking this is when you encounter one-on-one fights. A lot of its enemies are impossible to regard in your mind as genuine creatures.
Now you only got the one. You want to think careful. See, now you don't have any.
Without archers shooting at you over a lava pit, or environmental hazards complicating your navigation, or hidden pots that curse you that you also have to contend with, there's just not a lot preventing you from realizing how basic and underwhelming these enemies are. Here's a major gripe that I had with the game. In fact, this is one of the ones that really made me scratch my head because I really don't see what they were going for. In Dark Souls 1, you could level up at any bonfire in the game, but that was changed in Dark Souls 2. You now have to warp back to town and talk to a specific NPC to level up your character. Now, forget about how annoying that is on its own. As I've already discussed, Dark Souls 2's insistence on trolling you as you explore the world led me towards an attitude towards Souls of spend 'em if you got 'em. I never wanted to save up a bunch of souls and then level up a bunch of times in one visit to town. I wanted to level up every time I had enough souls to do so. And one of my least favorite things about this game is just how much of my time I spent in loading screens traveling to and from Majula. I also really disagree with the decision to tie your invincibility frames and your agility to the adaptability stat. It isn't explained at all, and I don't know how anyone figures it out without reading about it online. Until you upgrade this stat, you drink Estus flasks like an old lady searching her purse.
Hold on, I think I have 35 cents. No, those are nickels.
I don't think that quality of life features like this that make the game feel responsive and intuitive should be held hostage by stat investment. Every action RPG player is going to instinctively understand what they're doing when they upgrade their strength or intelligence or faith. But it was just a really bizarre decision to include a player stat that just turns down the baseline frustration of the experience. And that's just about all that I have to say about this game in this category. It was a fairly consistent experience. Just note that while I'm giving this game a higher score than Dark Souls in this category, that doesn't mean that it had fewer problems. It's just that Dark Souls' problems were easier to point to and say, look, a problem. In Dark Souls 2, these problems synergize to the point that they just become a baseline part of the experience, and the game's already lost points for how much less enjoyable that experience was. That brings the total score for Dark Souls 2 to 26 out of 40, just nudging it into the great range of my scale. I told you at the outset that this whiplash was coming, and here it is. Even though the commentary of this review has been mostly negative, I enjoyed my playthrough of this game. It wasn't frustrating in a way that really bothered me that much. It was frustrating in a way that made me very quickly just say, okay game, go ahead and troll me with those geckos, I'm just gonna start ignoring them. It was frustrating in a way that made me say, alright, thanks but no thanks to all those little hidden goodies you got over there. Let's get to the next boss please, come on, let's wrap this up, I got places to be. The playstyle that I described was not by any means devoid of fun or complexity. There were some times that I tinkered around with using different equipment or different consumable items to try to get through a tough patch of gameplay. Overall, the game did provide me with a good challenge. It just wasn't a challenge that was anywhere near as satisfying to navigate as the challenge in other Fromsoft games. I liked the game, I just didn't like it enough to want to stay and smell the roses. From about the 5-hour mark on, I was pretty dead set on just seeing the credits. I own the DLC for this game, but I've never played it, nor do I have any intention of playing it. In this last playthrough, I didn't find anywhere near all of the content in just the base game, and I didn't want to. In this mansion sequence, for instance, I found a hole in the ground that probably led to a trail containing some interesting loot, and I also strongly suspected that this hippo enemy that can destroy walls was probably the way that I was intended to get through some of the locked doors in the area. And I thought about checking out that hole, just like I thought about trying to bait the big guy into breaking some walls down, but then I just reflected on how fundamentally unsatisfying the process of going off the path had been for me the entire time.
Sucks to be you, fucker. You didn't know I had a little healing pool, did you? Yeah, I bet you feel stupid now. Just you wait. Just you wait till I'm at full health. Don't you
At the end of the day, I wasn't having too hard of a time just plowing through the game sticking to the beaten path, and so onwards I went, just taking in all the pretty sights and destroying the enemies that I had to fight to progress. I liked this game. If you're a fan of this series, I recommend that you check it out. In fact, I hope that you discover a way of playing it that makes it more enjoyable than the experience that I had. But at the end of the day, I can only review the experience that I had, and that experience, while well above average, was far short of what I've come to expect from Fromsoft. Let me put it to you this way, imagine that Paul McCartney had written the song Who Let the Dogs Out. Now, Paul is an unnaturally talented songwriter, so I'm sure that if he'd written that song that I'd like it, I'm sure that his version would have been catchy and memorable. But it would also be impossible to not perceive this song through the lens that it was written by the same guy who made Hey Jude and Let It Be. I don't think that I would include Who Let the Dogs Out by Paul McCartney on any of my shuffle playlists, but if it just came on the radio, I'd get a little dopamine hit. Hey, you remember that time that Paul McCartney huffed a bunch of glue and did some weird experimental shit? It's cool, I like it, I like that it exists, but I'm at the same time very glad that his later stuff is better. Like, lots better. vastly, objectively superior. Anyways, I've got some stuff I gotta take care of, so I'll talk to y'all later.